Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who hurt us deepest. And sometimes a father's shame can steal a daughter's childhood, leaving wounds that never quite heal. A woman steps from her stagecoach on a mountain trail, her fine dress a stark contrast to the wilderness around her. She's traveled hundreds of miles to find a legend, a wild mountain man the locals call Bear, but when she speaks a name from long ago, the giant freezes. It's not the name anyone has called him in 25 years. It's the name his daughter knew him by, before he disappeared into shame and left her to grow up believing he was dead. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine branches like memories refusing to fade, and Franklin Cross moved through it as silently as a ghost haunting his own life. 25 years in these mountains had worn away everything soft about him. His hands were leather now, scarred from countless encounters with thorns and stone, his beard a tangle of silver and brown that hadn't known a razor's touch since the day he'd fled civilization. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had once charmed investors and wooed a woman named Elena, still held intelligence beneath the wild exterior. He knelt beside the creek that ran cold and clear from the high peaks, cupping water in his palms and drinking deeply. The ritual never changed. Wake before dawn, check his snares, tend his small garden hidden in a clearing only he knew how to find. The locals in Pine Ridge, the ramshackle town 20 miles down the mountain, called him Bear for good reason. He stood 6.5 feet tall, broad as a barn door, and had once killed a grizzly with nothing but a hunting knife when it threatened his winter stores. They left him offerings sometimes, coffee beans, tobacco, a new pair of boots when the old ones wore through. In return, he'd leave fresh meat at the edge of town during the harsh winters, or guide lost travelers back to safety when the storms came howling down from the peaks. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. They got their legend, their wild man of the mountains who asked nothing of civilization. And he got to live with his shame in peace. But peace was a fragile thing, Franklin had learned. It could shatter with the sound of carriage wheels on mountain stone, with the rustle of silk where only rough wool belonged, with a voice calling a name that should have died with the man he used to be. The woman who stepped from the gold-trimmed stagecoach moved with the kind of confidence that came from boardrooms and business deals, not mountain trails. Her traveling dress was expensive, deep burgundy wool with velvet trim, but practical enough for the journey. She'd planned this carefully, Franklin realized as he watched from behind a stand of aspen trees. Her boots were sturdy leather, her gloves well-fitted, and she carried herself like someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. Victoria Cross had inherited more than just her father's pale blue eyes. At 38, she commanded respect in Denver's business circles, her textile empire built from the ashes of her mother's grief and her own fierce determination. She'd learned early that the world didn't owe her anything, that success came through sharp thinking and sharper negotiations. Men twice her age deferred to her judgment, banks competed for her business, and politicians sought her counsel, but none of that mattered here. In this wilderness where her father had chosen exile over family, she'd hired Josiah Flint to drive her stagecoach, paying him double his usual rate for the dangerous mountain journey. Josiah was 63, with a weathered face and hands steady enough to guide a team through narrow passes that would terrify younger men. He'd been making runs through these mountains for 40 years, and he knew the stories. "You sure about this, Miss Cross?" Josiah asked as she stepped down from the coach, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "That's wild country up there. Bear ain't the kind of man who takes kindly to visitors, especially women." Victoria's voice carried a note of steel that had cowed more than one business rival. "I assure you, Mr. Flint, I can handle one hermit." Josiah scratched his grizzled chin, studying the steep trail that wound up into the peaks. "Ain't just any hermit, ma'am. That man's been living like a ghost for more years than most folks can remember. They say he can track a whisper through solid rock, that he knows these mountains, like other men, know their own backyard. And he don't suffer fools, not even pretty ones with fancy carriages. Victoria adjusted her gloves, a gesture that spoke of nerves carefully controlled. Then it's fortunate I'm not a fool, Mr. Flint. The truth was more complicated than her confident facade suggested. She'd spent 3 years searching for Franklin Cross, following a trail that had grown cold decades ago. It had started with a slip of the tongue from her dying mother, a name whispered in delirium that didn't match the grave marker Victoria had visited every year since childhood. Elena Cross had taken that secret to her grave, but she'd left behind a letter hidden in her jewelry box, a confession written in a trembling hand. Your father may yet live. I pray you can forgive us both. That letter had led Victoria to private investigators, to courthouse records, to saloon keepers who remembered a disgraced businessman who'd fled Denver under a cloud of scandal. The trail had gone cold in Colorado Springs, then picked up again in Santa Fe, where a man matching Franklin's description had bought supplies before disappearing into the mountains. From there, it had taken 2 more years to trace him to Pine Ridge. To the legend of the mountain man they called Bear, a man whose real name no one remembered, if they'd ever known it at all. Standing in the thin mountain air, Victoria felt the weight of 25 years pressing down on her shoulders. She'd built her entire life around the absence of the man who was supposed to love and protect her. Every business success, every careful relationship, every wall she'd built around her heart, all of it shaped by the father-sized hole he'd left behind. Now she was here to fill that hole, or to bury it once and for all. The sound that made Franklin freeze wasn't her footsteps on the trail. He'd been tracking those for the past hour. It wasn't even the sight of her, though something about the way she moved stirred memories he'd buried deep. It was the moment she stopped at the edge of his hidden camp, looked directly at his hiding place among the trees, and spoke. "Hello, Papa," 2 words that shattered 25 years of carefully constructed solitude. 2 words that brought the past crashing down like an avalanche, burying the man called Bear under the weight of who he used to be. Franklin Cross stepped out from behind the trees, his massive frame seeming to shrink under the weight of recognition, and stared at the woman who'd called him by his true name. In his rough hands, worn smooth by decades of hard living, he clutched the only thing he'd kept from his old life, a leather-bound Bible with a faded tintype photograph pressed between its pages. The photograph showed a younger man with a trimmed beard and kind eyes, standing beside a beautiful woman holding an infant daughter. The man in the photograph wore a respectable suit and the confident smile of someone who believed the future held nothing but promise. That man had been dead for 25 years. But his daughter had found him anyway. The silence stretched between them, like a canyon too wide to cross, filled with 25 years of unspoken words and unanswered questions. Franklin's weathered hands trembled as he clutched the Bible against his chest, his pale blue eyes, so much like her own, darting between Victoria's face and the ground at his feet. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of coming winter and the weight of buried secrets. "You're mistaken," he said finally, his voice rough from years of speaking only to himself and the occasional passing deer. "Name's Bear. Don't know who this papa fellow is you're looking for." Victoria took a step closer, her expensive boots crunching on the carpet of pine needles that covered his camp. Franklin Augustus Cross, born September 15th, 1839 in Philadelphia. Married my mother, Elena Rose Whitfield, on June 22nd, 1858. Had a daughter named Victoria Elena Cross on March 3rd, 1861. Her voice never wavered, each fact delivered like a courtroom exhibit. Disappeared from Denver on November 14th, 1874, leaving behind a wife, a 13-year-old daughter, and enough scandal to fill the newspapers for months. Franklin's jaw worked silently, his massive frame seeming to shrink with each word she spoke. The Bible in his hands contained more than just scripture, Pressed between its yellowed pages was a deed document, signed in his own hand, but forged by another. The evidence that had destroyed his reputation and driven him into the wilderness. Kept all these years as a reminder of his shame. "That man died 25 years ago," he whispered. But the words lacked conviction, did he? Victoria's tone was sharp now, cutting through his denials like a blade through silk. "Because the man who died left behind a grave marker in Riverside Cemetery with the death date of November 20th, 1874. Funny thing about that grave, Papa, it's empty. I had it opened last year. The confession hit Franklin like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his broad shoulders hitting the trunk of a massive pine. His carefully constructed world of solitude and penance was crumbling around him, and all he could do was watch it fall. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "You shouldn't have looked for me. I'm dead to you, to her, to everyone who mattered. Mother's been dead for 3 years, Victoria said, and something in her voice finally cracked, revealing the pain beneath her composed exterior. 3 years, and she went to her grave believing the lie you both told me. That you were dead, that you died in some accident I was too young to understand. Do you know what that did to us? Do you know what it did to her?" Franklin's knees buckled, and he slumped against the tree trunk, the Bible falling from his nerveless fingers to land open on the ground. The forged deed fluttered in the breeze, its yellowed surface covered with the careful script that had once been his pride and was now his shame. "Elena's dead." The words came out as a broken whisper. "Consumption," Victoria said, her voice steady again, but cold as mountain stone. 2 years of wasting away, calling your name in her delirium while I held her hand and lied to her that you were waiting for her on the other side. Because that's what daughters do for their mothers. They lie to spare them pain. Just like mothers lie to spare their daughters the truth about fathers who abandon them. Franklin buried his face in his hands, his massive shoulders shaking with silent sobs. 25 years of self-imposed exile. 25 years of convincing himself that Elena and Victoria were better off without him, and now he learned that his choice had killed the woman he'd loved more than his own life. "I thought she'd remarried," he said through his tears. "I thought she'd found someone better, someone who could give her the life she deserved. I thought—" "You thought wrong." Victoria picked up the deed from where it had fallen, studying the careful forgery that had destroyed their family. "Cornelius Wade, your business partner. He did this, didn't he?" Franklin's head snapped up, surprise replacing grief on his weathered features. "How do you know about Wade?" "Because I've spent 3 years learning everything I could about the man who was supposed to be my father. I know about the Crosswade Land Development Company. I know about the accusations of fraud, the forged deeds, the investors who lost everything. And I know you ran instead of fighting." "I couldn't fight," Franklin said, struggling to his feet with the awkward movements of a man carrying too much weight. Not physical, but emotional. The evidence was too strong. Wade had planned it perfectly. Every forged signature looked like mine. Every altered deed bore my seal. I was ruined, finished. If I'd stayed, I'd have gone to prison and dragged Elena and you down with me. So instead, you chose to let us think you were dead." Victoria's voice was ice-cold now, all pretense of emotion carefully locked away. "You chose to let a 13-year-old girl grow up believing her father cared so little about her that he'd rather die than face his problems. I chose to protect you." Franklin's voice cracked like a whip, echoing off the mountain walls. "You think I wanted to leave? You think it was easy to walk away from everything I loved? I thought about coming back every single day for the first 10 years. Every sunrise, every sunset, every cold mountain night, when the loneliness ate at me like a cancer. But I stayed away because I loved you too much to poison your life with my shame. Your shame." Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your shame destroyed our lives anyway, Papa. Mother never recovered. She went through the motions of living, but part of her died the day you disappeared. And me, I spent my entire childhood wondering what I'd done wrong to make my father choose death over staying with me." Franklin reached out toward her, his scarred hands trembling, but Victoria stepped back. maintaining the distance between them like a shield. "Don't," she said. "Don't touch me. Don't apologize. Don't try to make this right with words. I came here for one reason, to understand why you chose to break our hearts instead of fighting for us. Now I know. You were a coward who chose the easy path of running away over the hard path of standing and fighting." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Franklin straightened to his full height, and for a moment, Victoria caught a glimpse of the man he'd been before the mountains had claimed him. Proud, strong and capable of great love or great fury. Easy. His voice was dangerously quiet. "You think living like an animal in these mountains for 25 years was easy? You think dying a little bit more each day, knowing I'd never see my daughter grow up, never hold my wife again, never know if you were safe or happy, or if you even remembered my name. You think that was easy?" "Easier than staying and fighting for us," Victoria shot back. "Easier than trusting that the people who loved you would stand by you no matter what Wade had done." Franklin was quiet for a long moment, studying the woman his daughter had become. She was beautiful, strong, obviously successful, and completely closed off from him. Everything he'd feared and hoped for in equal measure. "You're right," he said finally. "I was a coward. I chose exile over the possibility of prison, solitude over the chance that staying might destroy what reputation Elena had left. I convinced myself it was noble, that I was sacrificing myself for your good. But the truth is, I was terrified of facing the people I'd failed, of seeing disappointment in your mother's eyes, of watching you grow up knowing your father was branded a criminal." Victoria folded the forged deed carefully and tucked it into her coat. "At least you can admit it, for all the good it does now." Franklin picked up his Bible from where it had fallen, cradling it like a wounded bird. "Elena's dead, you hate me, and 25 years of my life are gone forever. Wade won completely. He destroyed my family and stole my future." "Wade's not done yet," Victoria said quietly. "That's the other reason I came to find you." "Papa, the past isn't as buried as you think it is." Before Franklin could ask what she meant, Victoria had turned and was walking back toward the trail, where Josiah waited with the stagecoach. But instead of climbing aboard, she shouldered a traveling pack and began walking up the mountain path, her stride determined and uncompromising. "Where are you going?" Franklin called after her. "To get answers," she called back without turning around. "With or without your help." Franklin watched his daughter disappear around a bend in the trail, her burgundy dress a splash of color against the gray mountain stone. For the first time in 25 years, he was no longer alone with his shame. But as he stood holding his Bible and watching the shadows lengthen across his camp, he wondered if the solitude of guilt might have been easier to bear than the company of judgment. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks and the sound of Victoria's footsteps growing fainter with each passing moment. Franklin Cross, the man they called Bear, stood frozen between his past and his future, unsure which direction led to redemption and which led to destruction. But his daughter was walking into the wilderness alone, and despite everything that lay broken between them, she was still his blood. With a curse that echoed off the mountain walls, Franklin shouldered his own pack and set off up the trail, following the only family he had left into whatever truth awaited them in the high country. The mountain trail wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the rocky path. Victoria's expensive boots, made for boardroom floors and city sidewalks, slipped on loose stones and struggled for purchase on the steep incline. Behind her, Franklin's heavy footsteps followed at a careful distance, close enough to help if she fell, far enough to respect the wall of anger she'd built between them. She'd been walking for 2 hours when the first blister began to form on her heel, the leather of her boots rubbing against skin unused to such rough treatment. Pride kept her from stopping, from acknowledging that her father's world demanded skills she'd never needed to develop. Every stumble, every labored breath in the thin mountain air felt like an admission of weakness she wasn't prepared to make. "Trail forks up ahead," Franklin called from behind her, his voice carefully neutral. "Left path leads to Deadfall and Bear Caves." Right path takes you toward the high meadows. Victoria paused at the fork, studying both options with the analytical mind that had served her well in business negotiations. The left trail looked easier, more traveled, while the right path climbed steeply through a narrow canyon between towering granite walls. "Which way are you going?" she asked without turning around. "Right." She started up the steep path without another word, ignoring the way her legs burned and her lungs fought for air. Behind her, Franklin followed in silence, but she could feel his eyes watching every step, ready to catch her if she fell. The attention grated against her independence like sandpaper against silk. The canyon narrowed as they climbed, the walls closing in until only a ribbon of sky was visible overhead. Victoria's traveling dress, practical though it was, caught on thorny bushes and snagged on rough stone. By the time they emerged into a high meadow, surrounded by peaks, her hem was torn, and her carefully arranged hair had come loose from its pins. "We'll camp here tonight," Franklin said, dropping his pack beside a ring of stones that marked an old fire pit. "Weather's turning." Victoria looked up at the sky, which seemed clear enough to her untrained eye, but she could hear the wind beginning to moan through the peaks above them. She set down her own pack, grateful for the rest but unwilling to admit it. "I don't need your protection," she said, as Franklin began gathering deadwood for a fire. "I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can." Franklin's tone was maddeningly calm. "In Denver. In your office. In whatever world you've built for yourself since I left. But this isn't that world, Victoria. This is mine. And in my world, people who don't know the signs freeze to death on beautiful, clear nights." As if to prove his point, the temperature began to drop as soon as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. Victoria pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, watching Franklin work with the efficient movements of a man who'd made camp 1,000 times before. He built the fire with practiced ease, arranged stones to reflect heat, and set up a simple shelter using branches and a piece of canvas he carried in his pack. "Learned that from the Ute," he said, noticing her watching. "First winter up here, I nearly died of cold and ignorance. Old chief named Running Bear taught me how to read the weather, how to find shelter, how to survive when civilization was just a memory." "Running Bear," Victoria repeated. "Is that where they got your name?" Franklin's hands stilled for a moment in their work. "Maybe. Or maybe it's because I killed a grizzly with nothing but a knife when it got into my winter stores. Stories grow in the telling, especially in places where entertainment is scarce." The fire crackled to life, pushing back the mountain darkness and creating a circle of warmth in the vast wilderness. Victoria sat on a fallen log, studying the man her father had become. His movements were economical, purposeful, shaped by decades of self-reliance. But sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught glimpses of something else, a careful tenderness in the way he arranged her sleeping area, a protective alertness in how he positioned himself between her and the dark forest beyond their camp. "Why did you follow me?" she asked as they shared a simple meal of dried meat and hard bread from Franklin's supplies. "Because you're my daughter," he said simply. "Because I've already lost 25 years with you. And I'll be damned if I lose you to a mountain cat or a winter storm. You lost me the day you chose to run instead of fight." Franklin was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick and sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. "Tell me about your mother," he said finally. "Tell me about the life you built after I left." Victoria's first instinct was to refuse, to keep that part of her life locked away from the man who'd forfeited his right to know about it. But something in his voice, a deep weariness that spoke of 25 years of wandering, made her reconsider. "She tried," Victoria said slowly. "For the first few years she really tried to rebuild. She took work as a seamstress, and I helped after school. We lived in a tiny apartment above Mrs. Hendrick's boarding house, and every penny went toward rent and food. But Mother was good with her hands, and word spread about her skill with fine fabrics." Franklin leaned forward, hanging on every word as if they were gold pieces in a miser's purse. "By the time I was 18, she'd built a small reputation among Denver's wealthy ladies. They came to her for their finest dresses, their most important occasions. That's when I convinced her to expand, to hire other seamstresses, to take on larger orders. I handled the business side while she focused on the craft. And you built an empire from that, Franklin said. Pride creeping into his voice despite everything between them. We built it together, Victoria corrected. Mother had the skill, I had the head for numbers and negotiation. Within 10 years, Cross Textiles was supplying fabric to half the businesses in Colorado Territory. We had contracts with mining companies, railroad companies, anyone who needed quality goods and could pay fair prices. Franklin smiled for the first time since she'd found him, and Victoria was startled by how much it transformed his weathered features. For just a moment she could see the man her mother had fallen in love with, handsome, intelligent, capable of great warmth. She kept the name, he said softly. Cross Textiles. She never remarried, Victoria said, and watched that smile fade. Oh, she had suitors, men who wanted to court the successful widow, who thought they could provide stability and respectability. But she turned them all away, said she was already married, even if her husband was dead. The words hit Franklin like physical blows, each one driving home the cost of his choice to disappear. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God forgive me, I'm so sorry." Victoria reached into her coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in silk, a hand-carved wooden doll, no bigger than her palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail lovingly rendered in smooth pine. The doll's face bore a resemblance to Victoria as a child, with carefully painted blue eyes and tiny yellow yarn for hair. "She kept this on her dresser," Victoria said, holding the doll up so the firelight played across its features. For 25 years, she dusted it every morning and said a prayer for the man who'd made it but never had the chance to give it to his daughter. Franklin's breath caught in his throat. He'd carved that doll during the last weeks before his world fell apart, working on it by lamplight after Victoria had gone to bed. It was meant to be her 14th birthday present, a replacement for the rag doll she'd outgrown but still kept out of sentimentality. "You were supposed to get that on your birthday," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I spent weeks getting the face just right, making sure it looked like you." "I figured that out eventually," Victoria said, turning the doll over in her hands. "It was the only thing she had left of you. The only proof that Franklin Cross had ever been more than just a name on a gravestone." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, and the vast wilderness stretching out in all directions. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human pain and regret. "What aren't you telling me?" Franklin asked finally. "You said Wade wasn't done yet." "What did you mean?" Victoria wrapped the doll carefully in its silk cloth and tucked it back into her coat. "I meant that some secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply they're buried. And some debts come due even after 25 years. Before Franklin could press her for details, she curled up in her blankets and turned away from the fire, signaling that the conversation was over. But sleep was a long time coming for both of them, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of what might have been if a man had chosen courage over cowardice. If a family had stood together instead of being torn apart by shame and fear. In his pack, Franklin kept his own treasures from the past, letters never sent, a wedding ring worn smooth by nervous fingers, and a silver locket containing a curl of baby hair the color of sunshine. Victoria's hair, cut on her first birthday, and saved by a father who'd never imagined he'd spend the next 24 years treasuring it as his only connection to the daughter he'd lost. Dawn came slowly to the high meadow, painting the eastern peaks in shades of rose and gold, while the western slopes remained shrouded in purple shadow. Victoria woke to the smell of coffee brewing over the rekindled fire and the sound of Franklin moving quietly around their camp. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and her feet throbbed from the previous day's hike. But she forced herself to sit up with as much dignity as she could muster. "Coffee's ready," Franklin said without looking at her, his voice carefully neutral. "We'll want to get moving soon. Storm's still coming, maybe by tonight." Victoria accepted the tin cup he offered, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the refined blends she was accustomed to in Denver, but it chased away the mountain chill and helped clear her head. "How far to wherever we're going?" she asked. "Depends on where that is," Franklin replied, settling onto a rock across the fire from her. "You said you came for answers, but you haven't told me what questions you're really asking." Victoria studied his face in the morning light, seeing past the wild beard and weather-beaten skin to the intelligence that had once made him a successful businessman. He was right. She'd come here with an agenda that went deeper than simple confrontation about his abandonment. "Do you remember Otis Brennan?" she asked. Franklin's eyes sharpened. "Otis ran the Copper King Saloon in Denver. Good man, honest dealer. Why?" "Because he remembers you too. And he remembers Cornelius Wade." Victoria pulled a letter from her coat, its edges worn from repeated reading. "I found him last year, living in a cabin outside Pine Ridge. He's the one who told me about the mountain man called Bear, who suggested you might still be alive." Franklin leaned forward, his massive hands clasped together. "What did Otis tell you?" "That Wade came to him 3 days after you disappeared, drunk and bragging about how he'd finally gotten rid of that self-righteous fool Cross. That Wade claimed he'd been forging your signature for months, building a case against you that would stand up in any court." Victoria's voice grew harder with each word. "That Wade said he'd make sure you never showed your face in Colorado again, dead or alive." The tin cup in Franklin's hands crumpled like paper, spilling coffee onto the ground. 25 years of guilt and self-recrimination warred with a growing rage that made his vision blur around the edges. Otis heard all this and said nothing. Otis was a saloon keeper, not a lawman. And who would have believed him against Cornelius Wade's word? Wade was connected, respected, part of Denver's business elite. Otis was just a man who poured drinks and listened to other people's troubles. Franklin stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the meadow where the ground dropped away into a dizzying vista of peaks and valleys. "So Wade destroyed my life, stole my family, and then celebrated it over whiskey. And I spent 25 years believing I deserved it." "There's more." Victoria joined him at the overlook, her voice gentler now. "Otis kept track of Wade over the years. The man got rich, Franklin, very rich. He expanded into mining, railroad investments, land speculation across 3 territories. And every few years, another businessman would disappear under a cloud of scandal, leaving Wade to pick up their assets at bargain prices. He made a career out of it," Franklin said, his voice hollow with realization. "I wasn't his first victim. I was just his practice run." Victoria reached into her coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft leather, a silver locket on a delicate chain. She held it out to Franklin, who took it with trembling fingers. "Mother gave me this before she died," Victoria said. "Told me it was the only thing of value she had left, and that someday I'd understand its importance." Franklin opened the locket with reverent care, and his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a tiny curl of golden hair, still bright after all these years, and a miniature portrait of Victoria as an infant. But it was what was engraved on the inside of the locket that brought tears to his eyes. "For my darling Franklin, who holds my heart wherever he may roam. All my love, Elena. She had it made for your last birthday together," Victoria said softly. "She was planning to give it to you Christmas morning, before everything fell apart." Franklin sank to his knees on the rocky ground, clutching the locket against his chest. Inside that small silver circle was everything he'd lost: his wife's love, his daughter's innocence, the family he'd abandoned in a misguided attempt to protect them. "I wore this under my shirt for 25 years, Victoria continued, "even after I learned the truth about your disappearance. Even after I decided to hate you for leaving us. Because it was the only connection I had to the father I remembered. Before shame and fear turned him into a stranger." They knelt together on the mountain overlook, father and daughter united in their grief for all the years that could never be recovered. Below them, the wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and unforgiving as the truth they were finally sharing. "She never stopped loving you," Victoria whispered. Even when the consumption was eating her alive, even when she could barely remember her own name, she'd ask for Franklin. She'd ask when you were coming home. Franklin's composure finally shattered completely. He wept for Elena's wasted life, for Victoria's stolen childhood, for his own cowardice that had cost them everything. But underneath the grief was something else, a burning anger that grew stronger with each tear he shed. "Wade has to pay," he said when he could speak again. "For Elena, for you, for all the families he's destroyed since mine." "That's why I'm here," Victoria said, helping him to his feet. "Because justice delayed isn't justice denied. And because some debts compound interest over 25 years. As they broke camp and prepared to continue their journey deeper into the mountains, neither of them noticed the rider watching from a distant ridge. The man sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to tracking prey through difficult terrain, and the Winchester rifle across his saddle gleamed dully in the morning sun. Cornelius Wade had built his fortune on careful planning and ruthless execution. He'd survived and prospered for 25 years by eliminating threats before they could become problems. And now that Franklin Cross had been found alive, along with a daughter who apparently shared her father's stubborn streak, Wade knew he had a new problem to solve. The rider turned his horse away from the ridge and began the long descent toward Pine Ridge, where a telegram waited to be sent and plans needed to be made. Franklin Cross had cost Wade too much already by staying alive when he was supposed to be dead. It was time to correct that oversight permanently. In the meadow below, Franklin fastened the silver locket around his neck, where it nestled against the worn leather of his mountain clothing, like a talisman against the darkness ahead. He had 25 years of guilt to atone for, a daughter's trust to earn back, and a reckoning with Cornelius Wade that was long overdue. But first, he had to make sure Victoria understood the danger they were walking into, because Wade hadn't built his empire by leaving loose ends untied. And Franklin knew that his own resurrection from the dead would be seen as a threat that demanded immediate action. The storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, both in the sky above and in the world below, and Franklin Cross was finally ready to stop running from the tempest he'd helped create. The town of Pine Ridge clung to the mountainside like a collection of weathered bones, its buildings connected by muddy streets and wooden walkways that creaked under the weight of boots and wagon wheels. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, carrying the smell of wood fires and cooking food into the thin mountain air. It wasn't much to look at, but it represented civilization in a land where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. 3 riders approached the town from the south, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cool morning air. The man in the lead wore expensive clothes that marked him as someone from the cities below, while his companions had the hard look of men accustomed to violence. They reined up outside the Copper King Saloon, where a weathered sign promised drinks, food, and information for those with coin to spend. Inside the saloon, Otis Brennan was wiping down glasses with a rag that had seen better days, preparing for the lunch crowd that would soon arrive. At 68, Otis moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints protested every motion, but his mind remained sharp as the day he'd left Denver and its painful memories behind. The bell above the door chimed as the 3 strangers entered, and Otis looked up from his work with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent 40 years sizing up customers. The leader was well-dressed but soft around the edges, the kind of man who solved problems with money rather than muscle. His companions were a different story, hard men with careful eyes and the bulge of concealed weapons under their coats. "Gentlemen," Otis said, his voice neutral and welcoming, "what can I get for you?" "Information," said the well-dressed man, pulling a small leather pouch from his coat and setting it on the bar. The clink of gold coins was unmistakable, about a woman who might have passed through here recently. Well-dressed, traveling alone, asking questions about the mountain man they call Bear. Otis continued polishing his glass, his expression unchanged. "Lots of folks pass through Pine Ridge, mister. Ought to keep track of them all." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Perhaps this will help refresh your memory." He opened the pouch and spilled a handful of gold eagles onto the bar. "The woman's name is Victoria Cross. She would have been asking specifically about Bear and where she might find him." The name hit Otis like a physical blow, though he managed to keep his reaction hidden. Victoria Cross, Franklin's daughter, the child who'd grown up believing her father was dead. If she'd found Franklin after all these years, and if these men were looking for her, then the past was finally catching up with everyone involved. "Afraid I can't help you," Otis said, scooping up the coins and pushing them back across the bar. "Don't know anyone by that name, and Bear keeps to himself up in the high country. Most folks are smart enough to leave him be." One of the hard men leaned forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Maybe you're not understanding the situation, old man. We're not asking politely, and I'm not answering rudely," Otis replied, his own hand dropping below the bar where he kept a sawed-off shotgun loaded with buckshot. "Just telling you the truth as I know it." The well-dressed man held up a hand, signaling his companion to back down. "Forgive my associate's enthusiasm. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Jerome Hartwell, representing certain business interests in Denver. We have reason to believe that Miss Cross may be in danger, and we're simply trying to locate her before something unfortunate happens." Otis had heard that name before. Hartwell was one of Cornelius Wade's front men, a lawyer who specialized in making problems disappear through legal channels or other means. If Wade had sent Hartwell to Pine Ridge, then Franklin and Victoria were in more danger than they knew. "Like I said," Otis repeated, his voice steady despite the fear growing in his chest. "Can't help you." Hartwell studied the old saloon keeper for a long moment, then nodded to his men. "We'll be staying in town for a few days, asking around. If your memory improves, you know where to find us." After the three men left, Otis stood behind his bar for several minutes, his hands shaking as he tried to process what had just happened. Victoria Cross had found her father after 25 years, and now Wade's men were hunting them both. If Franklin and Victoria were somewhere up in the high country, they needed to know that their past had finally caught up with them. Otis reached under the bar and pulled out a battered compass that had belonged to his grandfather, a surveyor who'd mapped much of Colorado territory in the early days. The compass was brass and silver, its needle worn but still true, and engraved on its face were the words, "True North Always." It had been a gift from Franklin Cross years ago, payment for information that had helped Franklin navigate the early days of his business in Denver. The old saloon keeper tucked the compass into his coat and headed for the back door. If he could reach Doc Palmer's cabin before Hartwell's men noticed he was gone, maybe there was still time to warn Franklin and Victoria about the danger heading their way. Meanwhile, high in the mountains above Pine Ridge, Franklin and Victoria had taken shelter in a grove of aspen trees as the first fat snowflakes of the coming storm began to fall. Franklin was teaching Victoria how to read the mountain signs, the way the wind shifted before a storm, how to tell fresh animal tracks from old ones, which plants could provide food or medicine in an emergency. "Your mother ever tell you about the compass I gave Otis?" Franklin asked as he showed Victoria how to build a proper lean-to shelter. "She mentioned it once," Victoria replied, struggling with the rope knots that seemed so easy when Franklin demonstrated them. "Said you gave it to him as payment for some favor back when you were starting the business." Franklin nodded, his weathered hands making quick work of securing the shelter's frame. "Otis helped me understand the politics of Denver business, warned me about men who smiled to your face and stabbed you in the back. If I'd listened to him more carefully about Wade, maybe things would have turned out differently." "Maybe," Victoria said, finally getting her knots to hold. "Or maybe Wade would have found another way to destroy you. Men like him don't give up just because their first plan fails." As if her words had summoned trouble from the gathering storm, Franklin suddenly went very still, his head tilted as he listened to sounds Victoria couldn't hear. His years in the mountains had sharpened his senses to an almost supernatural degree, and something in the wilderness around them had changed. "What is it?" Victoria whispered. "Riders," Franklin said quietly, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "3 of them, maybe 4, coming up the main trail from town. They're pushing hard despite the weather, which means they're not just passing through. Victoria felt her heart begin to race. Wade's men? Has to be, Franklin said, his mind already working through their options. Question is, how did they find us so fast? And what are they planning to do when they catch up? The snow was falling harder now, covering their tracks, but also making it harder to see potential threats. Franklin made a quick decision, shouldering his pack and motioning for Victoria to do the same. We go higher, he said, up where the horses can't follow, where the storm will cover our trail. If they want to find us, they'll have to do it on foot, in weather that can kill a man who doesn't know these mountains. As they began climbing toward the high peaks, leaving the shelter of the grove behind, Victoria couldn't help but think about the irony of their situation. She'd spent 3 years tracking down a father who'd become a legend in these mountains. And now they were both being hunted by men who wanted to ensure that Franklin Cross remained dead and buried. But she was no longer the sheltered businesswoman who'd stepped off that stagecoach. The mountains were changing her, just as they'd changed her father, teaching her that survival sometimes required choices that civilization would never understand. Behind them, the riders pushed onward through the gathering storm, following tracks that were rapidly disappearing under the falling snow. Jerome Hartwell pulled his expensive coat tighter around his shoulders and cursed Cornelius Wade for sending him into this God-forsaken wilderness. But Wade's instructions had been clear: find Franklin Cross and his daughter, and make sure they never made it back to Denver to tell their story. The compass in Otis Brennan's pocket pointed steadily north, as the old saloon keeper made his way through the storm toward Doc Palmer's cabin, hoping against hope that he could warn Franklin and Victoria before it was too late. The needle never wavered, just as Franklin's moral compass had never wavered, even when fear and shame had driven him into the wilderness 25 years ago. Now it remained to be seen whether that moral compass would be enough to guide them all through the storm that was about to break over Pine Ridge and the high country beyond. The storm struck with the fury of a wild animal, driving snow horizontally across the mountain peaks and reducing visibility to mere feet. Franklin and Victoria huddled in a shallow cave he'd carved from the lee side of a granite outcropping, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as the wind howled like a living thing outside their meager shelter. "Tell me about her," Victoria said, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "Tell me about Mother when you were happy together." Franklin wrapped his coat tighter around his shoulders, grateful for any conversation that might distract them from the cold and the knowledge that Wade's men were somewhere below them in the darkness. He pulled a worn piece of paper from inside his Bible, a marriage certificate, yellowed with age and creased from years of careful handling. "Elena Rose Whitfield," he said, running his finger along the faded ink of her signature. "She was the most beautiful woman in Philadelphia when I met her, but that wasn't what captured my heart. It was her laugh, this incredible sound like silver bells ringing. She could make me laugh even when business was going badly, even when I was so worried about money I couldn't sleep." Victoria leaned closer, studying the marriage certificate in the dim light of their small fire. Her parents' names were written in elegant script, witnessed by people she'd never heard of, from a time when the future had seemed full of promise. "How did you meet her?" "At a church social," Franklin said, and despite everything, he smiled at the memory. "I was 24, just starting out in business, wearing my only good suit and trying to make connections with Philadelphia's merchant families. Elena was there with her father. He was a textile manufacturer, one of the most successful in the city. I shouldn't have even approached her, but something about the way she was standing apart from the other young ladies, watching the dancing instead of participating, made me brave." "What did you say to her?" "I asked if she was afraid of dancing, or just afraid of the men brave enough to ask." Franklin's expression grew tender with the memory. "She looked me right in the eye and said she was afraid of neither, but she was particular about her partners. Then she asked if I thought I qualified." Victoria found herself smiling despite their circumstances. "And did you?" I stepped on her toes 3 times and apologized so profusely that she finally stopped the dance, just to assure me I wasn't crippling her permanently. Franklin's laugh was soft but genuine. By the end of the evening, I was in love. By the end of the month, I was courting her properly. By Christmas, I was asking her father for permission to marry her. He said yes. Franklin's expression darkened slightly. Eventually, Charles Whitfield was a careful man, and he wanted to make sure I could provide for his daughter in the style she deserved. I spent 6 months proving myself, showing him my business plans, my financial projections, my commitment to building something lasting. When we finally married, Eleanor and I both believed we were starting a life that would span decades. The wind gusted particularly hard, driving snow through the narrow opening of their shelter and reminding them both of their precarious situation. Victoria pulled the marriage certificate closer to the fire's warmth, protecting it from the moisture in the air. She never remarried, Victoria said quietly. Men courted her, successful men who could have given her security, respectability, children to replace the husband and daughter who'd been taken from her. But she always said no. Franklin's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with tension. She should have remarried. She should have found someone who wouldn't abandon her when things got difficult. Someone who would have been there when she was sick, when she was dying, when she needed. She didn't want someone else, Victoria interrupted. She wanted you, even after 25 years, even after building a new life from nothing. She wanted the man who'd promised to love her until death parted them. The problem was, you weren't dead, you were just gone. The accusation hung between them like a blade, sharp and cutting. Franklin turned away from her, staring out into the storm as if he could find redemption in its wild fury. I thought about coming back, he said finally. Every year on her birthday, every Christmas, every anniversary of the day I left, I'd pack my few belongings and start down the mountain, telling myself that surely enough time had passed, that maybe the scandal had been forgotten, that maybe there was still a chance for us. But you never made it all the way down. I'd get as far as the ridge overlooking Pine Ridge, and then I'd see the town below, people living normal lives, raising families, building futures, and I'd remember what I was. A coward who'd run from his problems, a man who'd let another destroy his family rather than stand and fight. What right did I have to waltz back into Elena's life and ask for forgiveness? Victoria studied his profile in the firelight, seeing past the wild beard and weathered skin to the man who'd been paralyzed by shame and guilt. The right of a husband who loved his wife. The right of a father who loved his daughter. The right of a man who'd made a mistake and wanted to make it right. Some mistakes can't be made right, Franklin said. Some choices destroy too much to ever be repaired, and some choices create new possibilities, Victoria countered. Mother kept hope alive for 25 years. Even when she was dying, even when the consumption was eating her lungs, she'd sit by the window and watch the road, waiting for the day you'd come home. She never gave up believing that love was stronger than shame, that family was stronger than fear. Franklin pulled his knees up to his chest, making himself as small as possible in the face of emotions too large for the tiny shelter. Then she died believing a lie. No, Victoria said firmly. She died believing in truth. The truth that you were still alive somewhere, still the man she'd married, still capable of choosing love over fear if given the chance. And she was right. You followed me into this wilderness, didn't you? You're here now, protecting me from Wade's men, risking everything to make sure I'm safe. That's different. It's exactly the same, Victoria said. Love. Making someone brave enough to face danger, to put someone else's welfare above their own safety. You think Mother would have cared about the scandal, about what Denver society thought of her husband? She would have stood beside you against Wade, against the whole world if necessary. The truth of her words hit Franklin like a physical blow. He'd spent 25 years convincing himself that Elena was better off without him, that his disgrace would have destroyed her social standing and Victoria's future prospects. But Victoria was right. Elena had loved him enough to wait 25 years for his return. She would have loved him enough to weather any storm together. She wrote letters, Victoria said softly, pulling another piece of paper from her coat. Hundreds of them over the years. Letters to the husband she believed was dead, but couldn't stop talking to. I found them after she passed, tied with a ribbon and hidden in her hope chest. She handed Franklin one of the letters, written in Elena's careful script on paper that smelled faintly of the lavender she'd always favored. His hands shook as he read her words, expressions of love that hadn't dimmed despite the years, updates on Victoria's accomplishments, questions about whether he was proud of the woman their daughter had become. She wrote to me every week for 25 years, Franklin whispered. She wrote to the man she married, Victoria corrected. The man she believed still existed somewhere, still capable of love, still worthy of forgiveness. The man who's sitting here with me now, finally ready to face the truth about what he lost and what he might still be able to save. Outside their shelter, the storm began to show signs of weakening. The winds howled, dropping to a low moan as the worst of the weather passed over the peaks. But inside the tiny cave, Franklin Cross was experiencing his own tempest, 25 years of guilt and self-recrimination, crashing against the possibility that redemption might still be within reach. He folded Elena's letter carefully and tucked it back into his Bible next to the marriage certificate that had survived all these years in the wilderness. For the first time since he'd fled Denver in shame and fear, Franklin allowed himself to believe that love might indeed be stronger than the mistakes that had driven him into exile. But first, he and Victoria had to survive the hunt that was closing in around them, and the reckoning with Cornelius Wade that could no longer be avoided. The storm had passed, leaving the high country blanketed in pristine snow that glittered like scattered diamonds in the morning sunlight. Franklin and Victoria emerged from their shelter to find the world transformed, familiar landmarks erased, trails obliterated, the very geography of the mountains made new by the night's fury. But it was what Victoria discovered in her coat pocket that truly changed everything. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice strange and hollow as she stared at a leather-bound ledger she'd pulled from her pack. "Something I should have told you from the beginning." Franklin looked up from where he was breaking camp, noting the pallor that had crept across his daughter's face. "What is it?" Victoria's hands trembled as she opened the ledger, its pages filled with neat columns of figures, dates, and business transactions. "This is from my office in Denver. Financial records for Cross Textiles, going back 15 years. She swallowed hard, her throat working as if the words were too large to speak. "Franklin, Cornelius Wade isn't just the man who destroyed our family 25 years ago. He's my business partner." The words hit Franklin like an avalanche, burying him under their impossible weight. He sank onto a fallen log, his face draining of color as the implications crashed over him. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I wish it weren't." Victoria's voice cracked as she flipped through the ledger's pages, each one a testament to her unwitting collaboration with the man who destroyed her father. Cross Textiles has been dealing with Wade Enterprises for over a decade. He's been one of our largest suppliers, providing raw materials for our manufacturing operations. The profits from those deals helped build my empire, helped make me one of the most successful businesswomen in Colorado. Franklin stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of their small clearing as if distance could somehow change the horrible truth. "Wade Enterprises," he repeated, his voice filled with bitter recognition. Cornelius always was clever with names, close enough to his own to feed his ego, different enough to hide his involvement. Victoria turned to a section of the ledger marked with red ink, her finger tracing down a column of increasingly large transactions. "It gets worse. 3 years ago, Wade Enterprises approached us about a major expansion, new textile mills, increased production capacity, contracts with railroad companies across the Western Territories. The profits were enormous, enough to triple our annual revenue. Railroad companies," Franklin said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. "Land grants, government contracts, the kind of deals that require significant political connections and questionable documentation. The kind of deals Victoria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. That would be impossible without forged deeds, fraudulent land claims, and the systematic theft of property from legitimate owners. She closed the ledger with a snap that echoed like a gunshot in the still mountain air. Franklin, my success, everything I built, everything I thought I'd accomplished on my own, it's all been funded by stolen money. Wade's been using me to launder his crimes for 15 years. Franklin returned to her side, his massive hands gentle as he took the ledger from her nerveless fingers. You didn't know, he said firmly. Victoria, you didn't know. But I should have, she said, tears freezing on her cheeks as they fell. I prided myself on knowing every aspect of my business, on understanding every deal and every partner. How could I have been so blind? How could I have worked with the man who destroyed my family and never realized who he was? Franklin flipped through the ledger, his business-trained eye quickly grasping the scope of the operation Wade had built. Because he was careful, he said grimly. Look at these transactions. They're structured to appear completely legitimate. Shell companies, intermediary brokers, enough layers of bureaucracy to hide the source of the money. You weren't blind, Victoria. You were deliberately deceived by a master manipulator. It doesn't matter, Victoria said, her voice hollow with despair. Don't you see what this means? Everything I've accomplished, every worker I've employed, every contract I've fulfilled, it's all been built on blood money. Wade hasn't just been stealing land and destroying families for 25 years. He's been using me to help him do it. The realization that his daughter had unknowingly become part of Wade's criminal empire hit Franklin harder than any physical blow. Not only had Wade destroyed Franklin's family, but he'd corrupted Victoria's success, turning her achievements into instruments of his continued crimes. There's more, Victoria said, pulling out another document, a contract signed just 6 months earlier. Wade Enterprises recently proposed a massive new venture, a consortium to develop mining claims across 3 counties, with Cross Textiles providing uniforms and equipment for the workers. The potential profits were staggering, enough to make me one of the wealthiest women west of the Mississippi. Franklin studied the contract, his face growing darker with each line he read. These mining claims, he said slowly, they're in territories that weren't available for private development 6 months ago. Government land, protected areas, property that would require congressional approval to access. Unless someone had been systematically forging government documents, Victoria finished. Unless someone had been using my business as cover for the largest land fraud scheme in Colorado history. The scope of Wade's operation was staggering in its audacity. For 25 years, he'd been stealing land, forging documents, and destroying anyone who threatened to expose him. And for the past 15 years, he'd been using Franklin's own daughter as an unwitting accomplice, turning her success into a weapon against her father's memory. He knew, Franklin said suddenly, his voice filled with cold rage. Wade knew exactly who you were when he first approached Cross Textiles. He knew you were Elena's daughter, my daughter. This wasn't just business for him, it was revenge. He's been torturing our family for decades, using you to validate his victory over me. Victoria pulled out the final document, a telegram dated just 3 days earlier, delivered to her Denver office, while she was already on her way to find Franklin. This came from Wade's lawyers. They're calling an emergency meeting of all consortium partners for next week. They want to finalize the mining development contracts and begin operations immediately. Franklin read the telegram, his hands clenching the paper hard enough to tear it. He's moving fast, he said. Some things made him nervous, made him want to accelerate his timeline. Me, Victoria said simply. My disappearance from Denver, my inquiries about you, the questions I've been asking about our family's past. Wade knows I'm getting close to the truth, and he's trying to lock in his biggest score before I can expose him. They stood together in the snow-covered clearing, father and daughter united in their horror at the scope of Wade's manipulation. But underneath the shock and grief was something else, a burning anger that had been building for 25 years. waiting for the right moment to explode into action. "We have to stop him," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength as resolve replaced despair. "Not just for us, not just for Mother's memory, but for all the families he's destroyed and all the ones he's planning to destroy." Franklin looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened child he'd abandoned 25 years ago, but a woman of formidable intelligence and determination. Wade had made a crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed that corrupting Victoria's business would break her spirit when the truth was revealed. Instead, it had forged her into a weapon capable of destroying everything he'd built. "It won't be easy," Franklin warned. "Wade has money, connections, political influence. He's had 25 years to entrench himself in Colorado's power structure. Going against him means risking everything, your business, your reputation, possibly your life." Victoria squared her shoulders, and Franklin saw Elena's fierce determination shining in her eyes. "Good," she said. "I've spent my entire adult life building something I thought was mine. Now I'm going to use it to tear down the man who stole my father, killed my mother, and turned my success into his weapon." Wade Enterprises is about to learn what happens when you underestimate a cross. The banker's ledger in Victoria's hands contained more than just financial records. It was a roadmap to Wade's entire criminal operation. A catalogue of stolen land and destroyed lives stretching back decades. And now, finally, it was going to be used against the man who'd created it. Franklin Cross, the man they called Bear, stood in the snow-covered wilderness and felt something he hadn't experienced in 25 years. Hope, not just for redemption or forgiveness, but for justice. The hunt that had driven him and Victoria into the mountains was about to become something very different. Now, they were going to be the hunters. The descent from the high peaks took them 2 days through treacherous terrain, made more dangerous by the fresh snow. Franklin moved with the sure-footed grace of a man who'd spent 25 years learning every rock and root of these mountains, while Victoria followed in his footsteps, her expensive boots finally finding their rhythm on the unforgiving trails. They were no longer the same people who'd first met in that mountain camp. The wilderness had burned away pretense and civility, leaving only the essential truth of who they were beneath the surface. On the morning of the 3rd day, they reached the abandoned mining camp that Franklin had chosen for their final preparations. The settlement had been built during the silver boom of the 1860s, but the veins had played out and the miners had moved on, leaving behind empty buildings and rusted equipment. It was isolated, defensible, and most importantly, it had something Franklin needed, a working telegraph key. "You sure this still functions?" Victoria asked, watching Franklin examine the brass telegraph equipment that sat on a dust-covered table in what had once been the camp's communication office. Franklin tested the key, listening to the familiar clicking sounds that had once connected this remote outpost to the wider world. "Telegraph lines run along the railroad tracks," he said. "As long as the wires are intact, we can send messages all the way to Denver." He'd spent the journey down from the peaks, planning their strategy with the methodical precision that had once made him successful in business. But this wasn't about profit margins or market share. This was about justice delayed for 25 years. And Franklin was determined to get it right. "First message goes to your office in Denver," he said, his fingers dancing over the telegraph key with surprising skill. "You're going to call that emergency consortium meeting Wade wants, but on your terms and your timeline." Victoria nodded, understanding the plan they'd developed during the long hours of their descent. "If Wade thinks I'm still ignorant of his true identity, he'll come to the meeting confident and unprepared. He won't expect the daughter of Franklin Cross to be waiting for him with evidence of his crimes." Franklin began tapping out the telegram in the rhythmic code he'd learned as a young businessman. "To Cross Textiles. Denver Stop Emergency Consortium meeting confirmed. Stop Thursday 2 p.m. Stop Prospect Hotel. Stop new evidence regarding mining claims requires immediate discussion. Stop Victoria Cross Stop." The response came within an hour, crackling over the telegraph wires with Wade's eagerness to finalize his largest scheme. Delighted by your prompt response, stop will bring full documentation. Stop this venture will secure both our futures. Stop, C. Wade. Stop. Victoria read the message with grim satisfaction. He still doesn't know that I know who he is. 25 years of believing he'd completely destroyed our family, and he can't imagine that his victory might be incomplete. Arrogance, Franklin said, his voice hard with controlled anger. It's always been Wade's weakness. He's so convinced of his own cleverness that he can't see the trap closing around him. They spent the rest of the day preparing for what was to come. Franklin cleaned and checked his weapons, a Winchester rifle that had belonged to his father, and a Colt revolver worn smooth by years of mountain living. But their most powerful weapons were the documents Victoria had brought with her, the banker's ledger detailing Wade's criminal enterprise, correspondence proving his systematic land fraud, and most damning of all, a list of the families he'd destroyed over the past 25 years. Doc Palmer will be there, Franklin said, as they went over their plans once more. I sent him a message through. Otis, he's been keeping medical records all these years, evidence of the accidents that befell anyone who got too close to exposing Wade's operations. Victoria looked up from the documents she was organizing. How many people has he killed? More than we'll ever know, Franklin replied grimly. But enough that the federal marshals will be very interested in what we have to show them. As evening approached, Franklin found himself studying his daughter in the lamplight of their temporary headquarters. Victoria had changed during their time in the mountains. The soft edges of civilized life had been stripped away, revealing the steel beneath. She moved with new confidence, her decisions quick and sure, her resolve unshakable. She was Elena's daughter in her compassion, but she was also his daughter in her refusal to back down from a fight. Are you ready for this? He asked. Once we walk into that hotel tomorrow, there's no going back. Wade will do everything in his power to destroy us, and he has resources we can barely imagine. Victoria looked up from the papers spread before her, and Franklin saw something in her eyes that reminded him powerfully of the young businessman he'd once been, before fear and shame had driven him into the wilderness. I've been ready for this my entire life, she said. I just didn't know it until now. Franklin reached into his pack and pulled out a small leather case, worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, a surveyor who'd helped map the early territories of Colorado. The watch was gold, its face marked with Roman numerals, and engraved on its back were the words, "To my son Franklin, may you always find your way home. Augustus Cross, 1855. Your grandfather gave me this when I started my first business," Franklin said, holding the watch out to Victoria. He said it would remind me that no matter how far I traveled or how lost I became, there was always a way back to what mattered most. Victoria took the watch with reverent hands, feeling its weight and warmth. I never knew him. He died before you were born, but he would have loved you, Franklin said. He believed that a man's true wealth wasn't measured in gold or land, but in the family he protected and the principles he refused to compromise. I forgot that lesson 25 years ago, but I remember it now. And tomorrow we put it into practice, Victoria said, fastening the watch chain to her coat. The weight of it against her chest felt like an anchor, not holding her back, but keeping her steady against whatever storm was coming. They worked late into the night, going over every detail of their plan, preparing for every contingency they could imagine. When Wade walked into that hotel tomorrow, he would expect to finalize the largest criminal enterprise of his career. Instead, he would find himself face to face with the past he'd thought he'd buried forever. Outside the abandoned mining camp, the mountains stood silent and watchful under a canopy of stars. Somewhere in the darkness below, Wade's men were still searching for Franklin and Victoria, unaware that their quarry had already slipped past them and was now preparing to turn the hunt on its head. Franklin stood in the doorway of their makeshift headquarters, breathing the thin mountain air and remembering all the nights he'd spent alone in these peaks, believing he was nothing more than a coward who'd abandoned his family. Now he understood that sometimes a man had to lose everything, his reputation, his pride, his very identity, before he could find the courage to become who he was meant to be. "Papa," Victoria said from behind him, and the word still had the power to stop his heart. "Tomorrow, when we face Wade, I want you to know something. I'm proud to be your daughter, not in spite of the choices you made, but because of who those choices helped you become." Franklin turned to look at his daughter, this remarkable woman who'd tracked him across hundreds of miles of wilderness, who'd forgiven him for 25 years of absence, who was now prepared to risk everything to see justice done. In her face, he saw Elena's beauty and strength, but he also saw something of himself, the part of him that had never truly died, even in the darkest years of his exile. "And I'm proud to be your father," he said. "Tomorrow, we finish what Wade started 25 years ago, but this time, the ending is going to be different." The telegraph key sat silent on its dusty table, having carried their messages of challenge and preparation across the mountains to the city below. Soon it would carry news of victory or defeat, of justice served or innocence destroyed. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of the abandoned camp, Franklin and Victoria Cross prepared for the confrontation that would determine not just their own futures, but the fate of everyone Wade had wronged over the past quarter-century. The pocket watch ticked steadily against Victoria's chest, counting down the hours until the reckoning that was finally at hand. The Prospect Hotel stood at the corner of 17th and Larimer in downtown Denver, its red brick facade and ornate windows speaking of prosperity and respectability. Victoria had chosen it deliberately. Wade's own money had helped fund its construction through one of his shell companies, making it the perfect location for his downfall. She stood across the street, watching the entrance, as handsome cabs and carriages deposited Denver's business elite at the front doors. Franklin waited in the shadows of an alley between two buildings, his massive frame concealed beneath a long coat and hat that transformed him from mountain legend back into civilized man. The transformation was startling. 25 years of wilderness living had changed his appearance, but underneath the weathered exterior, the intelligent businessman still existed. His father's Winchester rifle was hidden in a guitar case slung across his back, its weight a comforting reminder that words might not be enough to end this confrontation. "Target approaching from the north," Franklin murmured, his voice carrying clearly to Victoria despite the distance between them. Years of communicating across mountain valleys had taught him how to project without shouting. Victoria turned to see a familiar figure stepping down from an elegant black carriage. Cornelius Wade, now 68 years old, but still carrying himself with the arrogant confidence that had served him well for decades. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit with a gold watch chain, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his bearing that of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Beside him stepped two other men, Jerome Hartwell, the lawyer who'd been hunting them in the mountains, and a tall, thin man Victoria didn't recognize, but whose cold eyes and careful movements marked him as dangerous. Wade's insurance policy, she realized. He might believe Victoria was still ignorant of his true identity, but he hadn't survived 25 years of criminal enterprise by taking unnecessary chances. "Remember the plan." Franklin's voice reached her again, calm and steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "We stick to the script until you give the signal. Then we let them know exactly who they're dealing with." Victoria adjusted the leather portfolio under her arm. It contained copies of every document they'd need to destroy Wade's empire. The originals were safely hidden with Doc Palmer, along with detailed instructions for their delivery to federal authorities if anything happened to Franklin and Victoria today. She crossed the street with the confident stride of a successful businesswoman, nodding politely to the doorman who held the hotel's entrance open for her. The lobby was elegantly appointed, with crystal chandeliers and marble floors, filled with the low murmur of important conversations and expensive cologne. Victoria made her way to the private dining room she'd reserved, arriving precisely on time as was her custom. Wade was already waiting, standing beside the room's tall windows, with his back to the door in a calculated display of casual dominance. He turned as she entered, his smile warm and welcoming, the expression of a man who believed himself on the verge of his greatest triumph. "Victoria, my dear," Wade said, approaching with outstretched hands. "You look radiant. Mountain air agrees with you, it seems." Victoria allowed him to take her hands briefly, fighting down the revulsion that rose in her throat at his touch. This was the man who'd destroyed her family, who'd stolen her father and killed her mother as surely as if he'd put a gun to their heads. But she forced herself to smile, to play the role of the unsuspecting business partner for just a little longer. "Mr. Wade," she replied, "thank you for accommodating the schedule change. I know you're eager to finalize our arrangements." "Indeed I am," Wade said, gesturing toward the mahogany table where his documents were already spread out. "The mining consortium represents the culmination of everything we've worked toward together. Your textile operations, my land holdings, and the railroad contracts we've secured. It's going to make us both extraordinarily wealthy." Victoria took her seat across from him, noting how Hartwell positioned himself near the door, while the unnamed gunman moved to a spot where he could watch both the windows and the hallway. They were prepared for trouble, but not the kind that was actually coming. "Before we proceed," Victoria said, opening her portfolio with steady hands, "I need to address some concerns that have come to my attention regarding the provenance of these mining claims." Wade's expression didn't change, but Victoria caught the slight tensing of his shoulders, the way his eyes sharpened as he evaluated potential threats. "Concerns? What sort of concerns?" "The kind that arise when a businesswoman discovers she's been working with a man who's been systematically defrauding the government for 25 years, Victoria said, her voice remaining perfectly calm and professional. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Wade's genial mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath, before reasserting itself. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting," he said carefully. Victoria pulled out the first document, a deed to mining property that showed clear signs of forgery. The dates altered and signatures traced over genuine documents. "I'm suggesting that Cornelius Wade has been forging government land grants, stealing property from legitimate owners, and using my company to launder the proceeds of his criminal enterprise." Hartwell stepped forward, his hand moving toward his coat, but Wade raised a finger to stop him. The older man was studying Victoria with new interest, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You've been busy during your mountain vacation," Wade said, his voice losing its warmth. "Tell me, what else did you discover during your travels?" "I discovered that Franklin Cross didn't die 25 years ago," Victoria said, and watched Wade's face go white. "I discovered that you framed an innocent man, destroyed his family, and then spent the next quarter-century using his daughter to validate your crimes. I discovered that you've been stealing from the government, murdering anyone who threatened to expose you, and building your fortune on blood money." Wade was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table as he processed this new information. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder, more dangerous, stripped of all pretense. "Franklin Cross," he said slowly. "The ghost of Christmas past. I should have known that sanctimonious fool would find a way to reach out from beyond the grave to ruin me." "Where is he, Victoria? Where is dear old Papa hiding these days?" Victoria smiled, and there was nothing pleasant about the expression. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" The door to the private dining room opened, and Franklin Cross stepped inside. Not the wild mountain man called Bear, but Franklin Augustus Cross, businessman and father, his beard trimmed and his hair combed, wearing a suit that had belonged to his younger self, but still fit the man he'd become. The Winchester rifle was in his hands, its barrel pointing steadily at Wade's chest, "Hello, Cornelius," Franklin said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of 25 years of accumulated rage. "It's been a long time." Wade stared at the man he'd destroyed a quarter-century ago, his face cycling through shock, fear, and finally settling on cold fury. "Franklin Cross, I heard rumors that the mountain hermit might be you, but I chose not to believe them. After all, what are the chances that a coward would survive 25 years in the wilderness?" "About the same as the chances that a criminal would survive 25 years without being caught," Franklin replied. "But I suppose we're both about to find out how our luck runs out." The confrontation was finally joined, the man who'd run and the man who'd destroyed him, facing each other across a hotel dining room, with 25 years of hatred and pain crackling between them like electricity. In her chair between them, Victoria felt the weight of history pressing down on the moment, knowing that everything that had been broken so long ago was about to either be repaired or destroyed forever. Wade's hand moved slowly toward his coat, and Franklin's finger tightened on the Winchester's trigger. The first phase of their long-delayed reckoning was about to begin. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring between the two men, 25 years of hatred crystallizing into this single moment. Wade's hand had frozen halfway to his coat, his eyes locked on the Winchester's barrel that never wavered from its target. Franklin stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, but his finger remained steady on the trigger. He was here for justice, not murder. "You destroyed my family," Franklin said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of accumulated pain. "You took everything I loved and turned it into a weapon against me. Elena died believing I was dead. Victoria grew up thinking her father abandoned her. 25 years, Cornelius? 25 years of hell because you couldn't bear to see another man succeed where you'd failed." Wade's composure cracked, revealing the venomous hatred he'd carried for decades. "Succeed? You call that pathetic little land development company success? You were nothing, Franklin. A small-time operator with delusions of grandeur. Married to a woman who deserved better than a weak-willed fool who couldn't handle real business." "Real business," Franklin repeated, his voice growing harder. "You mean fraud, theft, murder?" "I mean survival," Wade snarled. "I mean recognizing that sentiment and morality are luxuries for men who don't have the stomach for what it takes to truly win. You could have been part of something great, Franklin. Instead, you chose to be an obstacle." Victoria stood slowly, her hand moving to the documents in her portfolio. "It ends here, Wade. The federal marshals are already reviewing copies of these papers. Your political connections, your bought judges, your network of corrupt officials, none of them can save you from this evidence." Wade laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Evidence? From a dead man and his criminally complicit daughter. Who's going to believe the mountain hermit and the woman who's been laundering stolen money for 15 years? "They'll believe Doc Palmer," Franklin said, "and Otis Brennan, and the families of every businessman who mysteriously died or disappeared after crossing you. And most of all, they'll believe this." Victoria pulled out the final piece of evidence, the original deed that had started it all, the forged document that had destroyed Franklin's reputation. But now it was accompanied by something new, a detailed confession written in Wade's own hand, obtained by Doc Palmer from a dying man who'd worked as Wade's forger for 20 years. "Jacob Morrison," Victoria said, watching Wade's face go pale at the name. "Your master forger. He lived long enough to detail every crime you've committed since 1874, including the confession that you framed my father to steal his legitimate business and eliminate a potential rival." Wade's eyes darted toward the window, then to Hartwell, then to the gunman who waited for orders. Franklin caught the movement and shifted position, keeping his rifle trained on Wade, while positioning himself to handle multiple threats. "Even if that's true," Wade said, his voice regaining some of its calculated composure, "you have a problem. You're sitting in a room with 3 armed men who have no intention of letting you leave with those documents. Kill me, Franklin, and you'll never make it out of this hotel alive. And then what happens to your precious daughter?" "Then I suppose," Franklin said calmly, We'll find out whether a coward can learn to be brave, or whether 25 years in the mountains taught me something about fighting that you never learned about stealing. The words were barely out of his mouth when three things happened simultaneously. Hartwell drew his pistol from inside his coat. The unnamed gunman reached for the weapon at his hip, and Victoria dove toward the floor while pulling a small derringer from her skirts, a precaution Franklin had insisted upon during their planning. Franklin's Winchester spoke first, the boom of the rifle deafening in the enclosed space. Hartwell spun backward, his pistol flying from nerveless fingers as Franklin's bullet shattered his shooting arm. The unnamed gunman had his weapon half drawn when Victoria's derringer cracked like a whip, the small caliber bullet taking him in the shoulder and spoiling his aim. Wade had used the chaos to draw his own weapon, a nickel-plated revolver that gleamed in the hotel room's gaslight. But as he brought it to bear on Franklin, he found himself looking down the barrel of the Winchester once again. "Drop it." "Cornelius," Franklin said, his voice steady despite the cordite smoke that filled the air. "It's over, is it?" Wade asked, and his smile was the expression of a man who still held cards to play. "You shoot me, and you become the criminal. Self-defense only works if there are witnesses willing to testify on your behalf. Do you really think Denver's business establishment is going to take the word of a mountain hermit over?" The door burst open, and Federal Marshal William Hayes entered with two deputies, their badges gleaming and their weapons drawn. Behind them came Doc Palmer, Otis Brennan, and three men Victoria recognized as prominent Denver businessmen who'd been among Wade's victims over the years. "Marshal Hayes," Victoria said, getting to her feet and dusting off her skirts. "Perfect timing. We have a gift for you." Wade's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, calculation, and finally resignation, as he realized that the trap had been even more complete than he'd imagined. The federal authorities had been waiting in the hotel all along, summoned by the documents Franklin and Victoria had provided and ready to witness Wade's confession of guilt. "Cornelius Wade," Marshal Hayes said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government, forgery of federal documents, theft of public lands, and murder. You have the right to—" "I know my rights," Wade interrupted, his voice bitter with defeat. He looked at Franklin with undisguised hatred. 25 years. 25 years you let me think I'd won completely. Why now, Franklin? Why come back from the dead just to destroy me?" Franklin lowered his rifle but kept it ready. "Because some debts can't be forgiven, Cornelius. And because my daughter deserved to know that her father wasn't the coward she'd been told he was." Victoria moved to stand beside Franklin, pulling out the original deed to the Cross family homestead, the one piece of property Wade had never been able to steal because it had been purchased legitimately, with clean money, by Franklin's father decades earlier. She placed it on the table where Wade could see it, the deed that represented everything he'd tried to destroy and failed to touch. "The Cross family survives," she said simply. "Your empire dies today." As the marshals led Wade away in shackles, followed by the wounded Hartwell and his gunmen, Franklin and Victoria stood together in the destroyed hotel room, surrounded by the wreckage of a confrontation 25 years in the making. "Is it really over?" Victoria asked. Franklin looked at his daughter, this remarkable woman who'd found him in the wilderness, forgiven him for his failures, and helped him find the courage to face his demons at last. "The part that matters is," he said. "The rest is just paperwork." Outside the hotel windows, Denver bustled with the business of ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that one of the largest criminal enterprises in Colorado history had just been brought to justice by a mountain man and his daughter. Armed with nothing but truth, courage, and 25 years of accumulated determination, the ghost of Franklin Cross had finally been put to rest. The man himself was ready to live again. 6 months after Cornelius Wade's arrest, Franklin Cross stood in the Riverside Cemetery in Denver, holding a bouquet of mountain wildflowers he'd picked that morning from the high meadows where he and Victoria had first truly talked. The headstone before him was simple granite, bearing Elena's name and the dates that marked her too brief life. But the inscription below had been changed at Franklin's request. Beloved wife and mother, who kept faith when faith seemed impossible. Victoria stood beside him, wearing a black dress that spoke of mourning finally given its proper expression. In her hands was a new photograph, the first taken of Franklin in 25 years, showing him clean-shaven and dressed in respectable clothes, standing beside his daughter in front of the Denver courthouse, where Wade's trial had concluded just 3 days earlier. She would have been proud, Victoria said softly, placing the photograph against the headstone. Not just of the justice, but of us, of what we became together. Franklin knelt and placed his wildflowers beside Elena's grave, his weathered hands gentle against the earth that covered the woman he'd loved and lost. I spent 25 years believing I'd failed her, he said. Now I understand that the failure would have been giving up, letting Wade's lies become the final truth about who we were as a family. The trial had been a sensation in Denver's newspapers, revealing the scope of Wade's criminal enterprise and vindicating dozens of businessmen who'd been destroyed over the years. Franklin's testimony had been front-page news for a week, the mountain hermit who'd returned from the dead to see justice done. But more important than the public vindication was the private healing that had taken place between father and daughter. Have you decided? Victoria asked as they walked away from Elena's grave. About the offer? Franklin considered the letter in his coat pocket, an invitation from the territorial governor to serve as a special investigator, helping to root out the corruption that Wade's network had spread across 3 states. It was an opportunity to use his hard-won knowledge of survival and human nature in service of justice, to make sure that other families wouldn't suffer as his had. I think your mother would want me to say yes, he said finally. But only if you're certain about your own decision, Victoria smiled, the expression transforming her face and reminding Franklin powerfully of the young woman Elena had been when he'd first fallen in love with her. Cross Textiles is being restructured as a legitimate business, with full restitution to anyone who was harmed by our unwitting participation in Wade's schemes. It'll be smaller, cleaner, but it'll be honest. And it'll give me a chance to travel with you when your work requires it. They walked through Denver's streets, noting how the city had grown and changed during Franklin's exile. New buildings, new businesses, new families, building lives that Wade's criminal enterprise would never again be able to destroy. The world was different now, and so were they. Doc Palmer wants to retire, Franklin said, as they approached the boarding house where he'd taken a room while adjusting to civilization again. He's offered to sell me his practice. Said the mountains need someone who understands both medicine and the people who choose to live away from cities. And I think I'd like that, Franklin admitted. A chance to help people instead of hiding from them. A chance to use what the mountains taught me for something other than survival. Victoria stopped walking and turned to face her father fully. Papa, are you happy? Really happy for the first time in 25 years? Franklin looked at his daughter. This remarkable woman who'd tracked him across hundreds of miles of wilderness, who'd forgiven him for his failures, who'd stood beside him against their family's destroyer. In her face, he saw Elena's beauty and strength, but he also saw something new, the possibility of a future built on love rather than loss. I'm getting there, he said honestly. Every day with you, every letter I write to Eleanor's grave, every morning I wake up knowing that the truth has finally been told. It all helps. The mountains taught me how to survive alone, but you taught me how to live with family again. They continued walking until they reached the photographer's studio where Franklin had sat for his first portrait in a quarter century. The photographer, a young man named Peterson, had captured something in Franklin's eyes that spoke of hard-won wisdom and carefully guarded hope. One more picture, Victoria said, taking Franklin's arm. But this time we commission it. Father and daughter together, looking toward the future instead of the past. They posed in front of the studio's painted backdrop, not the formal, stiff arrangement that had been fashionable in Elena's day, but something more natural and warm. Franklin's hand rested on Victoria's shoulder, and both of them were smiling with genuine happiness. When the photograph was developed, it would show two people who'd found each other again after 25 years of separation. Two survivors who'd chosen love over bitterness and hope over despair. The camera's shutter clicked, preserving the moment for posterity, and Franklin felt something inside his chest that he hadn't experienced since the day he'd fled Denver in shame and fear. It was the feeling of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than his own guilt and regret. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains that had been his home for so long, Franklin sat at the desk in his boarding house room and began writing. Not a letter to the dead, but a letter to the living, to Victoria, expressing thoughts that were still too large and complicated for speech. "My dearest daughter," he wrote, "you came looking for a father and found a broken man hiding in the wilderness. But in saving me, you also saved yourself, and in forgiving me, you taught me how to forgive myself. The mountains will always be part of who I am, but they no longer define the limits of who I can become. We have lost 25 years, but we have gained something more precious, the knowledge that love is stronger than shame, that family is stronger than fear, and that it's never too late to choose courage over cowardice. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, and I am honored to be your father." He signed the letter with the full name he'd reclaimed, Franklin Augustus Cross. Not Bear, not the mountain hermit, but the man Eleanor had married and Victoria had forgiven. Tomorrow he would give the letter to his daughter, and they would begin planning their new life together, a life built on truth rather than lies, on connection rather than isolation. Outside his window, the lights of Denver twinkled like earthbound stars, and beyond them, the mountains rose dark and eternal against the night sky. Franklin had spent 25 years learning their lessons of endurance and survival. Now it was time to learn the lessons of love and family that Victoria and Eleanor had been trying to teach him all along. The photograph on his dresser showed a father and daughter reunited, their faces bright with hope and determination. It was proof that some stories, no matter how badly they begin, can still find their way to happiness. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, love really can conquer all the mistakes of the past and build something beautiful for the future. Franklin Cross closed his letter, sealed it with wax, and settled down to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve justice and heal the wounds that Wade's crimes had left across the territory. But tonight, for the first time in 25 years, he would sleep peacefully, knowing that he was no longer alone in the wilderness of his own making. The mountain man had come home at last.